Well, great. It's always wonderful when things are not what you expect them to be. Um, so thank you for that introduction. I'm very glad to have been invited to speak at this event tonight, and I hope I'll be able to communicate some of the latest research that I've been working on the last years. Then I have to set one thing straight, because over dinner it became very clear that people thought that archaeology is natural science. Archaeology is a hardcore humanities discipline. The kind of archaeology I do was born 300 years ago with the German art historian Winkelmann. So it's about the Mediterranean and about how cultures developed in a stylistic way, how representations of people can be dated through art historical ways of viewing things. So that's basically the training that I did. I studied in Copenhagen, in Rome, and in Oxford. I did a postdoc in Hamburg. And then I thought I wanted to turn archaeology into something different. I'm not alone about this. There's, of course, a whole movement where archaeologists have begun to work with natural science methods in a highly contextualized context. And I was lucky to convince the National Research Foundation to award me a Center of Excellence, which opened in 2015, called Center for Urban Network Evolutions, where we run a series of projects from Northern Europe to the east coast of Africa in order to look at urban societies over a long period of time, so from the 3rd century BCE down into medieval times, and look at how networks between societies, within societies, and among people developed. If you are interested in knowing more detailed stuff, we have all our annual reports with a lot of details in them on our center webpage. So our hypothesis is that at some point in history, the world really became connected. We didn't even come up with that. Polybius, who's an ancient writer, tells us that after the Punic Wars, everything in the world was connected. So we are looking at globalization at an early point in time. And we wanted to test that in a larger perspective, namely going from Northern Europe and down to the east coast of Africa, because a lot of research has earlier been done on Silk Road trade, east-west, and those sorts of things, but people have not really looked in too much details on how did rock crystal, for example, come from Madagascar or the east coast of Africa all the way up into Viking graves in Denmark, and what are the implications of these objects that moved around? How many people would move around with them? How would they move around, and what would that matter? So we are a lot of people in the center, and I spend most of my time managing that. But when I'm lucky as well, I get to go in field work, and since 2011, I have been running a project in Jordan, in Gerasa, Jerash, which is located in northern Jordan, 70 kilometers from the Syrian border. So we can still work there despite the situation in Syria, but we do feel that things are changing quite rapidly. This is what we would call a middle-sized city of the Roman period. It's around 90 hectares, and if a hectare doesn't tell you very much, I can say that the city walls that surrounded the city are a little bit more than 4 kilometers long, so you can run them, depending on how good you are at running, in 20 minutes or something like that. It's an interesting town that we know existed all the way back, not as a town, but as a settlement in the Neolithic period. It's one of the so-called mega sites of the very early period. So we are not specialists on that period, and we have not worked on that, but our Jordanian colleagues have, in a spot right outside the Greco-Roman city itself. But we have historical sources that mentions this city also as being a foundation of Alexander the Great, who settled his Greek veterans after he conquered the East. That's probably a legend. Anyhow, that's what the written sources say. What is very interesting, though, is that even in the 9th century CE, we have Arab writers who write about the population in this city as being half Greek and half Arab. So there's sort of this, at least, idea about the society being mixed up by different population groups. And that sort of persists. So in traditional archaeology, these are the boring plans that we sort of work with, two-dimensional things that allow us to look at how cities looked in ancient times. And you can see here the city wall, you can see the main street, you can see all the normal monuments that a normal Roman city would have. So you have theaters, you have temples, you have more theaters, you have baths, and so on and so forth. So this is in principle pretty boring because everybody in a city needed infrastructure. They needed public monuments, they needed places to go bath, they needed places to go worship, so on and so forth. And I wrote a book on these very boring things, and I published that as well. And it sort of made me think, well, maybe there are other things to do and more fun things to do. And that's why I started this project together with a German colleague of mine on what we call the urban periphery of the city center. But we were not, of course, the first to rediscover this site. So in 1806, a German traveler, Ulrich Jasper Seetzen, traveled in the region and was the first Westerner to sort of rediscover, or at least find out, that this must be the city mentioned in the Bible as Gerasa and mentioned in other sources. And after him, a large number of people traveled to that place and said it was either amazing, or as you can see, a British traveler in 1836 said, I should call Jerash a very fair specimen of a second-rate provincial Roman town. And that's also in principle why it's a very interesting place to visit, because normal places are what we are surrounded with in the real world. It's very seldom that you actually encounter something very particular, for example, like this part of Copenhagen is. So normal stuff can be quite interesting to study because they can be used as case studies or lenses for potentially larger phenomena. Yeah. So I hosted a conference in Copenhagen last year that was called 110 Years of Excavations, because the first illegal excavations took place in Jerash, as far as we know, in 1907, where a large mosaic was found and split up into pieces. And I'm sorry for this legend, but that just goes to show that it went to X amounts of private collections around the world, and that's when urban archaeology in Jerash started. So I'm also not claiming that I invented urban archaeology in this spot as well. I'm not even claiming that I invented high-definition archaeology, because I found out 2 years ago that the first and only female Nobel Prize winner in chemistry from Britain, Dorothy Hodgkin, actually did high-definition archaeology in Jerash in 1928. So that's quite a while ago. Her father was the director of the British School in Jerusalem, the British School of Archaeology, and he also headed some of the large excavations at this site in the 1920s. And she was a fantastic artist, so she did drawings of the mosaics from the churches and the houses, so on and so forth. And on top of that, she took small mosaic tesserae of glass with her back to Oxford, to the labs there, and had them analyzed and figured out what they were made of and what colored the glass in antiquity. I'll show you what we can do today with this sort of stuff, but you know, I didn't even invent that concept either. And that's interesting. When I gave a talk in Oxford last year about the research we've been doing, I actually was taken to the Ashmolean Museum and saw the last of her small glass tesserae. So these sort of historical moments is also what interests me. So what's very interesting about Jerash, apart from being a second-rate provincial town, is actually that it is and was in antiquity cut through by a river. It's located in what is a semi-arid area. There's desert to the east, but the region where it's situated in is actually quite fertile. But what is quite particular is exactly as I said, that the river cuts the city in half. So in antiquity and even today, it has to be connected by bridges. So you have to have a lot of gut to actually put out a city on a river and say, we are now going to construct something artificial. If it breaks down, we just can't talk to each other anymore. So they were actually quite good at constructing these architectural monuments. And the river, as a part of the urban landscape, meant a lot to the city, and we've done some investigations that I'll talk about on that front. When we talk about urban development in antiquity, we often have to deal with urban development in modern times as well, because what we of course have seen not only in the Middle East, but also in the Middle East, is an extreme amount of modern urban development. And here you see some aerial photographs from 39, 53, and a satellite image from 2015. And you see the way in which the modern settlement has encroached on the ancient urban sites. You see here the city walls running around the ancient city, and you see the small settlement here, and in 2015 you see how the modern settlement has encroached on the site, and that is actually only a little bit less than half of the site. So we're dealing with a very partial view on what we can say about the city as such. We've tried to deal with this problem by integrating LiDAR, so airborne laser studies of the landscape, and modeling it through, well, computer modeling, in order to sort of look at the development over time and over thousands of years, and see what that actually, what developments has been in the area and what impact it's had on the development of the city. And just like to sum up the urbanization problematics, you can see here a map of urban areas in Jordan in 1992, and how that really within these very few years, in fact, have expanded extremely rapidly. I mean, both in Palestine, Israel, and on the Jordanian side. So the red dots are all the cities and settlements that really have exploded. So we are looking at a region that is in rapid development, and if we want to study ancient sites, of which there are many in this region, we actually are working under quite a bit of pressure, because cultural heritage protection is not what there's money to put into these regions. So I ran a PhD course down there in March 2015, and what we were confronted with when we came down there was a bulldozing of one of the most pristine city walls in the ancient world, for example, because the city council wanted to construct a nicer road that would allow people to get from one side of the city to the other. So there went the idea of making this archaeological site into a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Again, there are more practical issues that these people need to deal with, but we are losing a lot of knowledge about antiquity and in principle about our cultural heritage in these regions. So part of the work that we have been doing in the last few years because of this development has really focused on restructuring the landscape of the ancient city in different phases. So that's a very technical, down-to-earth thing, and you can do a lot with LiDAR data these years. And we were allowed by the military to buy this data, because Jordan is a country that's through and through LiDAR, because it's on the border of Israel, and they need this sort of material for potential warfare issues. But if you don't work in a high security zone, you are allowed to buy the data. And we've done, I think, very nice things with the data until now. And I think in a few weeks we have an article coming out on this work in PNAS, which is, again, for a humanities person like me, very nice to actually be able to communicate the sort of deeply basic research that we actually also as humanities people can communicate to the world in a journal that people actually read. So, as I said, focus has been on these monuments, and I also told you that I partly have written a book on this, and it's of course important to understand why you put stuff in your cityscape and what you use it for. Religion was something that was extremely essential to societies in the Roman period. Every day was about religion. Ritual was embedded in the way that you worked, in the way that you lived your life, and Jerash was no exception. One of the largest sanctuaries from the Roman world is situated here, together with another large sanctuary of Zeus. So these are monumental architectural complexes developed over centuries around which the settlement grew. So colleagues really thought that we were quite crazy when we went up to the highest point of the city in 2011 and said that we wanted to work on a very small area, 4 hectares, on which there was just rubble stone. We really had students who were quite puzzled when they came down there and thought, well, why are we not like sort of doing building stuff, and why are we counting these stones? But as you can see actually on the satellite image, you can see that there are quite many structures. You just don't see them when you're on the ground because they're so weathered. And even on the geophysical image here, you actually see that the settlement on the hill, which is the highest point of the city, had the most fantastic view over the city, is laid out on a set of terraces with roads running from terrace to terrace and along the hill as well. So we wanted to move outside of what was the city center in order to explore the urban periphery and see what that in principle told us about how urban life was lived over a long period of time. And we published a much more interesting book on that last year, which has our results and which is available both in English and Danish because it came out together with an exhibition we did on the work we've done in Jerash. So the area we work in is also marked by having been used for agriculture for many hundreds of years. So the site was resettled by Circassian communities that were moved from Eastern Europe or from the Balkans to Jordan in the 19th century, as you see. So they had their settlement on the eastern side of the river, but they had all their fields on the other side. So this is the area that we are working in now, and as you see here in this aerial photo, you can see that there are actually field systems all over. And a lot of the topsoil, as we call it, or top stones, really also carry traces from manual plowing with horses and cattle. So we have a lot of activity going up on there, but it's also extremely complex activity. So you have basically the material that you have, and that's the limestone bedrock. So it turned out that all this area was actually used as a stone quarry, which is maybe not a surprise, because if you have a mountain, why don't you just try to cut it down and build your house in that mountain with those stones? So that's actually what you did. But what you then also did was to reuse these stones in buildings over thousands and thousands of years, and that is very difficult to date stylistically because a square limestone is a square limestone, and that stayed square for many thousands of years. So we wanted to get further into why does the site look as it does, and why was there so much activity going on for a long time. What we can say is that all activity in our area ended extremely abruptly with the large earthquake which hit the Levant in 749 CE. And after that, the area went completely deserted and was left deserted until the Middle Ages. And there's a whole story about that, a case story about that later in my lecture. Okay, so I see that these maps are a little bit overexposed to light, but what they are supposed to show you are in principle a chronological development of things really taking place, beginning to take place in the 1st and 2nd century CE, intensifying in the late Roman and Byzantine period, and even continuing against some historical narratives straight into the early Islamic period and only ending in the middle of the 8th century. And here you just see a small summary of that. Again, what I said, intensification in the settlement all the way up into the middle of the 8th century. And the reason that I'm underlining this is that we still in European or Western history try to tell this narrative of everything going bonkers after the Romans lose the East. So there are books called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire, Declines of Cities in the East after the fall of the Roman Empire. But in principle, what we see in the archaeology is really a complete continuity in the East, straight into the middle of the 8th century. And I'll show you some extremely interesting cases of how interpretation of material culture carries on straight into this period. What we've also been interested in is, of course, working with how do urban societies become resilient and what are their resilience thresholds. I think that's an important question to answer also in a modern context, of course, but how to work with that through an archaeological perspective. And that you can do very neatly in water-based societies, as societies were in the Near East, because without constant access to water, these societies would die out within a few weeks. So that's also why the river and the springs surrounding the river were extremely important to the Gerasene society all through time. So we've worked through our LiDAR data also and archaeological surveys on really mapping how water was brought into the city. And this is the area that we work in. This is the middle of the city. This is the river that runs through the city. And you see that almost no natural water sources are carried into the city in this whole western part of the city. So everything went through the uppermost part of the city where we work. And that's quite significant. And because of this extreme topography also with the riverbed, I mean, all the water that ran through the city also only fed the lower parts of the city. So all the upper parts of the city basically had to be fed artificially, and that tells us something about the level of organization of the society, because it takes a very joint effort to actually make this water flow 24/7. This is the sad river today. In antiquity, it was called the Chrysohoros, so the golden river. That's quite significant when you now look at how much there's left. But as you also see, the riverbed is actually all year round. This is taken in high summer when it's 42 degrees, and the riverbed is still very green. So one understands why it is that this area in antiquity also was extremely fertile and really very self-sufficient. But what we have been able to actually look at through geoarchaeology, so through understanding the development of the riverbed, for example, is that there were phases of floods and droughts, for example, and also that there was periods where pollution was extremely intensive in the urban environment, and that had an impact on how the population of the city could actually cultivate the land around the city. So they began to mismanage the agricultural land, maybe because of disease through lead pollution, which is not a very nice thing to suffer from. And slowly, because they did not manage the hinterland, erosion processes that got completely out of control began to move into the city. And I think that's an important point, because we always think about landscapes being destroyed because of human activity. But this is a beautiful case of landscapes actually being destroyed because humans stop to manage them. So the urban landscapes become destroyed. Here you see one example of a massive earth profile. It's actually more than 12 meters high in the middle of the city. It's actually down here by one of the theaters, and that is interestingly not an erosion profile. So through, again, archaeological examinations, we've been able to determine that all this earth was in fact moved around by people. That's again quite crazy organizational thing to do, to move this much earth around, to put a church on top of that. And I'll come back to that in a bit. So through geoarchaeological investigations, it's actually been possible to begin to look at some of these trajectories between landscape and urban societies, and also look at the correspondences and differences in pollution, erosion, and these extremely actually human-driven processes. So as I said, actually the beginning of the mismanagement of the hinterland led to more erosion inside the urban landscape, and basically that came out of control. And that, of course, in turn, might have had something to do with deforestation, so with using all the wood that you have in the hinterland for fueling. And I have an interesting case study that sort of underlines that this might have been the case, so keep that in mind. But central for these case studies, of course, are that water is alpha and omega for these societies, and management of water is something that we can actually investigate structure of urban societies through. And that's why even boring monuments like Nymphea might be interesting to study. So we have a lot of crappy stuff up in this area. As you saw, there were no standing buildings. Everything is smashed. We have more than 1 million pottery sherds. And I mean, we have very dedicated students who actually wash these and count these and look at these and describe these and think they want to go home after 2 weeks, but we keep them for 8. And this is basically how our finds look. This is glass, and it's just a small part of what we have. But glass is a very interesting object group because glass is not local. Glass comes from somewhere else. It's something that's moved around in the Mediterranean on large scale. Either it's completely imported, or then when you break it on your kitchen floor or in your dining room, you can decide to pick it up and actually remelt it and do a new object for it. So we thought, oh, why don't we look at glass to see whether that develops over time and what that tells us about how these people actually lived, how much money they had, what they preferred, and so on and so forth. So what we did was to take a large sampling group of identifiable objects. And these might not look identifiable to you, but if you're a glass expert, you know that this is a bowl rim from the 2nd century CE, and so on and so forth. That's why we need experts, that this is part of a cosmetic flask. I mean, you might be able to see that this is part of a glass, actually, and this was part of a lamp stem. These things you can date, again, stylistically very nice, because we have thousands and thousands of these from the Mediterranean, so we know sort of when they were made. But when it becomes really interesting is, of course, if you can begin to see what's inside these glasses, what are they made from? Because glass has the history that the raw glass was either made in Egypt, in the Natron Valley, so natron glasses, and later plant ash glass was introduced. So if you can get at the trace elements in these glasses, so actually see what they are composed of, you know whether they either originally, or whether the raw glass came from Egypt, or whether it came from the Levantine coast, so what today is Israel, Palestine, and there are 2 big production centers there, Jalame and Apollonia in the late Roman period. So we looked at, in this perspective, with ICP-MS analysis, where did glass come from in Jerash? Where was it imported from? And interestingly enough, it was imported from both places. Maybe that's not a surprise, because Jerash is around here, Egypt is there, Apollonia is there, Jalame should have been here. It's not very far away. There would have been connections. But what we began to see in the glass was that the later we got in time, the more recycling of the glass intensified. So some people would say, oh, that's a sign of decline. That's urban decline if you have to reuse your resources. But in fact, it could also be a way of innovating and reusing in an optimal way the material that you have. So we wanted to look at also what were these things recycled with what sort of fuel was used, and what could that tell us about the urban networks of the city. We have a fantastic lab, a Niels Bohr professor lab, the Ægir lab at Aarhus University, whom we work together with, and they have these very expensive machines. Fairly small machines, but they do amazing things. And they are almost non-invasive, but you saw our object groups. I mean, they were really crappy, so we can put them into these sorts of machines and have very tiny holes made in them, and we know what things are composed of, basically. So, as I said, we could tell where all these glasses came from, and we could also tell that in our small area, glass basically over time came from all over these raw glass production centers. But very interestingly enough, we could tell that in the early Islamic period, which supposedly was a period of decline seen from a Eurocentric perspective, there was extremely many imports from Egypt, from Palestine, and even from Iran in the private houses. And that's, of course, a very interesting cultural historical observation that you could never have seen if you couldn't have combined these methods. So in this historical narrative, even though the saying goes that the Umayyad were on the verge of breaking down and the earthquake really broke them down, the Umayyads in Jerash don't really seem to have been aware of that. They had very big selections of very fine objects imported from all over, not all over the world, but all over a much larger region than thought until now. Back to the recycling again. We could see, again, in the trace elements compared with glasses from other places, that there was an extreme pollution of the recycled glass in Jerash. We could see that it was contaminated, on the one hand, by the wood that was used to recycle it, but then we also observed an interesting chemical change in the fuel that was used in the 6th century CE, because we can date these pieces very nicely. And it turned out that they stopped using wood, but went over to using olive pits. As you might know, the Mediterranean is a place where they grow a lot of olives, so that's what they have. But if you think back to what I said about the deforestation, this is exactly the point in time where mismanagement of the hinterland began, which might have been a result of urban health issues as well as deforestation. And that we can now show through the glasses. Yes, the olive trees seem to have stayed, but the rest of the wood was gone, and they basically had to settle for a different kind of fuel, not only for the glass, but we have found this in the big bath complexes as well. It's lucky that olive pits burn really well, and you can really heat them up very much, but it does tell us something about big structural changes in the way you use and can use resources in urban settings. And that's, of course, very interesting to be able to bring these geoarchaeological perspectives together with the studies of the trace elements in the glass. So these very technical things really allow us to ask the large cultural historical questions, and that's what really interests me as an archaeologist, being a humanities person and only learning how to actually really integrate natural science in the right way through the right sort of questions in archaeology. We've also done studies on urban infrastructure in order to see, were the Romans really as rigid as always said? They liked straight streets going, straight from city walls down to the main street of the city. But sometimes it's also just us who like to draw streets on maps because they look nice. So we investigated, among other things, a projection of a street that's always been on maps of this city since the early 20th century, and found out, no, that street was not there. I mean, that's not particularly high definition to do that, but what was high definition about what we did was that all the organic material that we found in these completely empty trenches, we could actually see were indications for extensive amounts of urban gardening taking place. So large parts of the city were actually left open, without buildings, without structures on them, through centuries and centuries, because they were supposed to feed the people who lived right next door. Maybe in situations where you couldn't go outside of the city wall, so conflicts. This was a region, as it is today, which was under a lot of pressure. There was a lot of religious tensions. There were several wars between the Romans and the Jewish societies. I'll get to talk a little bit about that. So it made sense that urban societies also were sort of self-sufficient, even if they had to close themselves off completely for a period of time. Another hypothesis is, of course, that we like green spaces inside our urban spaces as well, and it gives us a bit of mental peace if we can go out into the garden. So there might be a combination of these factors going on, but again, these are things that you can't see with the bare eye. But of course, water resources again remain a central factor and of importance to actually making all this happen. Without water, nothing. And the water installations that we have investigated truly show that the Romans were great, or not the Romans, but Roman technology was great for urban engineering. In the first 4 centuries CE, we have a lot of water pressure pipes and water brought in from 12 kilometers away from the city, so on and so forth. And that does truly change in the later periods, where water becomes a private thing. It becomes something you keep in your houses. It becomes something you collect on the roof, and not something that you share as a society. So that's actually something that we can observe in the house architecture of this area and of this specific area of the town as well. And that, of course, again tells us something about the civic organization of societies that are in transitional phases and under different political and partly also religious systems. So we've been working with a lot of radiocarbon dating of shitty things in order to really understand, because there's also a cultural history that says the more shitty things look, the less Roman they can be, because the Romans did really nice stuff. And that's, of course, also a myth, but don't forget that it's actually something that is really communicated. I mean, if you read Asterix and Obelix or something like that, I mean, the Roman images are also very nice, and it's the Gallic societies that are living in crappy little villages but having much more fun. So we are having these cultural narratives somehow communicated in more or less subtle ways. Okay, that's a generalization, but it's still nonetheless quite true. So you probably can't even see, but this is a large cistern. It's rock cut in the bedrock, and it's on the southern slope of the area that we work in. And it's been said for decades and decades that this must be of the Islamic period, because it's just really ugly. I mean, they didn't even really cut it properly. But we could sort of see that it was used for a long time, and it was repaired, and they did stuff to it. So we thought, it must be more than just having been used for a century. And there again was one of the cases where we could actually, together with our very good AMS lab, so radiocarbon dating lab in Aarhus, do a big sampling study of hydraulic mortar in order to get closer to the different phases of this cistern. And interestingly enough, it turned out that it was smack Roman. It couldn't be anything else than 2nd century CE, and perhaps even earlier, so we are being quite conservative here in the view we are taking on this, and that it actually ended already before the earthquake. And at some earlier point also, it was even used as a small village in the late Roman period. So again, a completely different cultural, historical narrative of a very shitty and uninteresting complex that gives us so much information about what actually went on. Much more information than a theater, for example, would have given us. Production techniques as well are wonderful ways of inquiring into continuity and change in urban societies and how also knowledge networks worked over time. We are working in a region, of course, that had in antiquity large Jewish societies, and in Jerash there's a very famous complex called the Synagogue Church. That's of course a silly name. There was never a synagogue, there was a church, or the other way around. But this was a complex that once was a synagogue and at some point in time was turned into a church. That's not something that happens very often because you actually don't want to touch other people's religious buildings. You don't build them inside old things. So this is a very particular case. So we've not worked in this church, but we've worked right next to it because we were investigating underground production centers of olive oil, and we wanted to get into the caves, and we had to open a cave right next to the church. So this is the church. We know from an inscription on a mosaic floor inside the church that that was turned into a church in 531. Is that interesting to know? Yes, it's interesting to know because this is a period under Justinian, who was not a great fan of the Jewish societies because they wanted to stick with their own God, and he was Christian. And he was not very tolerant towards the Jews. So there's always been the implication that there was this sort of tension in taking over this church. We were, in that way, lucky to actually, instead of bumping straight into the cave we had hoped to find, bumped into a large mosaic hall. And this is where like traditional archaeology can do it for you, because if you're lucky, people leave inscriptions. And if you're really lucky, they leave inscriptions with dates on them. And that's what these people did. And this is not something I've come up with, and I'll show you the transcriptions in a moment. So they even actually dated the mosaics, and the mosaics are not very interesting, or the inscriptions are not very interesting, because they basically tell us, well, they are interesting, but they basically give us names of bishops and of military units, of special military forces that are moved from somewhere in the empire into Jerash at this point in time with their own tax person. So I have them in a German translation because the best epigrapher in this area, he's German, and we published them in a German journal. So he was a Silbereintreiber. That sounds really sort of biblical. Well, it is also sort of a biblical term. So he's getting the taxes for these numerus electi, which are special forces that are living in this area. In March 576, and they are still there in July 591. That is, of course, interesting in connection with the church, because what was the case was that these soldiers probably came to Jerash, took over, in this case, a synagogue from the Jewish community and threw them out, built their church and put down their mosaics, and so on and so forth. But an even more interesting thing is, after the special forces were thrown out, because we have the Arab invasion of 636, when there are big uprisings and big political changes and military changes in the region, the Byzantine army leaves. But instead of smashing their church, it's reused straight into the middle of the 8th century. They didn't really care about the inscriptions. They even put down a wall, but they didn't care to cover it up completely. But they really took care of the mosaic floors and just changed the building to fit their own needs. So a continuity of the use of a religious building in the Islamic period, but in a completely unreligious way. So these are earthquake damages. The whole complex was destroyed in 749. But an interesting story about well, here in this case, religious appropriation in late antiquity through the Byzantine army. And interestingly enough, and this is why archaeology also is a humanities science and a really core, in that way, conservative thing. We read Greek texts and these sorts of things, and they can tell us stuff. This is, again, the area that we work in, and right around the area we work in, it then turns out that all the inscriptions connect to the military. So it seems as if they appropriated, in the 6th century, this whole area, put in their inscriptions by their tribunes, and put up big churches. That's what you would do. Military need churches as well. And in this period, actually, churches is something that is used as the most, first and foremost, public monument. So Gerasa holds 27 churches that are built from the 5th century down into the 7th century CE. And that's not particular for a second-rate, middle-sized city of this period. So we get to the early Islamic period, which I really think, even as a classical archaeologist focusing basically on the Greco-Roman world, is one that has been an eye-opener for me to work in. Because as I told you, we began to understand that this whole area was completely destroyed in 749. And here you actually see some of these earthquake-destroyed areas, buildings that have just tumbled down. And we did some excavation of private houses, where we, on the one hand, were really lucky to find a house that was undergoing major restoration at the time of this earthquake. We know from sources that the earthquake took place on the 18th of January, so in the winter, and it can be quite cold in the Middle East at these points in time also. So you did indoor activity. So you renovated your house in the winter, which makes sense. But even more interesting, what they were doing were that they were preparing the whole house for new mosaics. So they had a large throw, ephemeral construction in the house full of these tiny mosaic tesserae that were about to be laid in the house, in big upstairs, upper floor mosaics. Why is that interesting? Because we know people decorated houses and like these sorts of things, but it's extremely interesting because classical archaeologists think that mosaics were only done in workshops. So it's a big discussion in archaeology. Well, you know, where did the mosaicists actually make their stones? They probably made it in the shop, and then they carried it to the house and they put it there and they took away the trash. But now we have a fantastic example showing us that they did everything inside the house. This is actually one of the very few visual representations, and this is why conservative classical archaeology is fun as well, because they did images of what they did. So we have a little man here sitting and doing small mosaic stones. His colleague is putting them into a basket, and they're putting them into bags and carrying them somewhere. So we can't see whether this is a workshop or inside a house. But this is, for example, one of the pieces of evidence that have made people believe these things are only done in workshops, and then they carry the finished product into the house. On top of that, we were so lucky to find our first earthquake victim, and this is evidence of child labor, which is not a surprise in antiquity. So a 12-year-old girl who was killed in the earthquake and found with the mosaic hammer in her hand, basically squished under the door. So really, again, an underlining of these things being made on the spot. Here you see some of our C14 dates, and as you can see here, no doubt that this happened exactly in the moment of the earthquake, namely in the middle of the 8th century. So we have another domestic complex, which is exactly the same, where we found an amazing amount of objects spanning the Byzantine period straight into the early Islamic period, a coin hoard that basically also constricts the time frame of when this house dates to. It's a very interesting coin hoard because it's a mix of Byzantine coins and early Islamic pre-Reform coins. But what you can see on these Islamic coins is that they actually use the Byzantine symbolic value, because coins hold a symbolic value at this point. They are not only worth what they are in metal, they are worth something because the emperor says they are worth something. And the Arab caliphs, they had to sort of carry that tradition on because that's what society believed in. So they couldn't just make completely new coins. So they used images of bishops on their Islamic coins, but they have inscription telling us that these are not bishops, but they are the Islamic caliphs. Very interesting visual representation carried through into the early Islamic period. But this is the most beautiful example, and it's also the last example I'll show you, and I hope I've not spoken for too long time, but when you, as an archaeologist, find a thing like this, it's a tiny little thing, 5 centimeters long, and you see that there's a meshed up scroll inside it, you know that you are looking at a magical amulet, and what could be more interesting than that? So magic is something that you used in antiquity a lot. You used it for love spells, you used it for getting at your enemies, you used it for curing your children, and the interesting thing is you used it in all cultures. So the Greeks used it, the Romans used it, the Jews used it, Semitic cultures used it, so on and so forth. So this is of course something that you can't just take out. Well, you can take it out, you see that we did that, we conserved it, and you can see that there's writing on it, but you can't unfold it, because it'll just fall apart. But first we tested the metal, and it actually turned out not to be lead as we thought, but it was pure silver mixed with gold, so actually quite a precious legation. And then we found a philologist, and they are fascinating people. I mean, speak more to them, they know a lot about language. We found a specialist in Semitic languages. And then we sent him to a firm who works with airplane crashes. So he was trained in using software of how to unfold metal that has been folded in complex ways. And he worked on this little piece of silver for 3 months, and you can see what happened when we CT scanned it. You can really see how complexly it's folded, because you were never meant to read a magical amulet. Once you had done the spell, you put it into a case and you carried it around, and you weren't able, you shouldn't read it anymore. Oh, what happened when we unfolded it digitally was that we could see that it started as any Greco-Roman magical amulet with Greek magical letters, just, you know, saying nothing, but being magical in themselves. And then it continued in 16 lines of Arabic. So this is a one-off, really, in a domestic context. And our philologist friends, they were extremely disappointed because they couldn't read it. So it didn't say anything. It uses 12 different Arabic letters in different combinations. But to us, as classical archaeologists, that was not a surprise, because it's a magical spell. You're not supposed to read it. You just fold it away, put it into your amulet, and carry it. But this is, I think, you know, one of the most fascinating examples of what you can actually do when you combine high-definition archaeology with knowledge of cultural history, because this is really a wonderful object that transcends the Semitic, the Greco-Roman sphere, right into the early Islamic period. We still don't know whether they were Muslims. We had this accepted to Nature Scientific Reports, and we were really excited about that. But then journalists wrote, and this is why I think we as humanities people also need to publish things in our own journals. The title of the article where this was communicated to the public in was, how did it go? Muslim goes to Jewish magician to get Greco-Roman magic. And that was not very good, because we are working in a region with a lot of religious tension. So the director of antiquities called us and said, what are you saying, that there were Jews here on this side of the Jordan in the 8th century? That was in principle not what we have said. I mean, there could have been, but it was not what we have said. But the journalist hadn't understood that Semitic doesn't mean Jewish necessarily. So I also ask people who communicate science, or at least I was taught a lot about that, of opening up the way we communicate about our research to the public. So we basically had to republish it in a really boring journal, but where we got to say what we really wanted to say. Yeah, so very traditional, low-scale, messy, ugly archaeology, because this is not beautiful archaeology as well, and on top of that it's 42 degrees warm for 8 weeks every summer, and I have been doing this for the last 8 years, but it can actually tell us extremely interesting narratives about world history in a different setting. And this is world history because, as I also showed you with the opening citation, the world was connected at this point in time. So what we are doing at the center right now, for example, is working on glass trade from Ribe, where we have very large excavations headed by my colleague Søren Sindbæk, to the Eastern Mediterranean and down to the coast of Zanzibar, because we really have unlocked through our new glass analysis how to actually understand glass over centuries, for example, and we'll be able to do that with other object groups as well. And this is of course not research I do on my own, but with the whole team that dedicate a lot of their time, and it couldn't be done without the funders. We do a lot of public outreach, but we also try to make our people do some of this outreach also. And if you want to know a little bit more about our research, we'll get our book either in English or Danish, because we've published it in both languages, and it tells you some of these fascinating narratives in a much more condensed way. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.